Hello everyone, how are you getting on? And welcome to our latest episode of the Retro Ups and Downs. Perhaps you're wondering why I'm wearing a dressing gown. At this point, do you not just kind of go with it? We will be covering one of the most infamous episodes of Star Trek to have ever been released. But just a really quick rundown on how we choose our episodes. What we will do is we will put together a poll with a choice of 4 episodes. What we'll do is a critically acclaimed episode, such as The Best of Both Worlds that we did last, then an episode that is generally considered to be quite poor, then one that is quite funny, and one that we feel is often forgotten. We will put those up in polls, and then you, the beautiful followers and subscribers and all the rest, will vote on it, and we will go with your choice. So this is your chance to get involved and make sure that, your choice gets picked. To do that, make sure that you're following us over on Twitter at TrekCulture. Make sure that you're following us on Instagram at TrekCultureYT. We're on Blue Sky, TikTok, and of course you're probably obviously watching this on YouTube, but keep an eye on the community page as well. I mean, here we go. Folks, we're covering Threshold. Threshold is one of those episodes that has reached such levels of discussion that it's one of those ones, if you haven't seen it, you've seen bits of it. It's one of those ones. It is largely inoffensive, but it goes into the realms of batshit crazy as the episode goes on. And it's definitely got a cult following, I'll tell you that right now. Picture it, the Delta Quadrant, 2372. And we open up on an up, which is this opening scene of Tom Paris piloting the shuttlecraft Cochrane, and he's trying to break the Warp 10 barrier. So there's no preamble, there's no, this hasn't been one of those things that's been coming for the full season. Unfortunately, while bits of the shuttle may or may not hit the Warp 10 barrier, the rest of it bloody doesn't, and boom, he's dead, that's the end. And I thought it was a bold way to open the episode, killing off Tom Paris in such a fashion. They're running simulations based on some new type of dilithium that they found that can basically stay stable in much higher velocities. The target is break the Warp 10 barrier. Warp 10, I should say this now as we go on, so Warp 10 was decided by Gene Roddenberry at the beginning of the next generation, that's important, to be the infinite speed. Once you hit Warp 10, you're at all places of the universe simultaneously. Basically, it was their way of going, we need to have a limit. You can't go beyond this. Because if you think of the original series, people are nipping about at higher velocities, and it was retconned into being, it was a different type of warp scale. So the hard barrier is Warp 10. If you like, the premise of this episode is that they are trying to achieve the unachievable. And there's a certain, perhaps arrogance is the wrong word, but certainly there's a dismissive nature in the way that B'Elanna, Harry, and Paris are sitting in the mess hall trying to go over the notes. Neelix comes over and offers to help. And the 3 of them are not very nice to him, really. So my first down of the episode is, lay off, yous bullies. All he did was offer to help. And in fact, Neelix is the one who cracks it because of an experience he had in his past while he was an assistant engineer. He realized that traveling into a dark matter nebula, not all parts of the ship were as protected, if you like, against the nebula. This inspires Paris to go, hold on, what if the fuselage isn't moving at the same velocity as the nacelles, which is what's causing the nacelles to rip off in these simulations, and therefore the ship explodes. So thanks to Neelix's input, they're able to achieve their goal. And I love that because Neelix is so often just categorized as this annoying comedy character. But early Neelix was, well, frankly, he could be a bit catty in return, so good on you for sticking up for yourself. But yeah, like, he lived a life. Based on this, they run another simulation and, wouldn't you know it, the simulation shuttle achieves the Warp 10 barrier. They break transwarp. So they take this to the observation lounge, to Captain Janeway and to Vok and Chakotay, and they get the green light to make a manned flight. Janeway is delighted initially for Paris because she says that he's about to join a very select group of pilots. And one of those includes Orville Wright, and then Neil Armstrong, and of course, Zefram Cochrane. There's a down in that list, but for me to fully explain it, I need you to stick around for the observations at the end of the episode, okay? Trust me on this one. Trust me. As you would expect, the Doctor runs a scan on Paris based on the trials and to get him ready for the flight. Now, he finds a tiny chance that perhaps there is an enzyme imbalance that might cause Paris to hemorrhage during the flight. How it's, astronomically small numbers. But Janeway goes to Paris and informs him of this and says, we're gonna give the flight to Harry Kim. And what we get is a brilliant up of a performance from Robert Duncan McNeill. I cannot heap enough praise on him in this episode because he has to swing for the fences as the episode goes on. But this initial scene of his hopes, you have that sort of bullish, if you like, there's a slight petulance in the beginning of the scene, as he reacts quite poorly to being told, we're taking the flight off you. But he rallies and explains why it's so important to him. And this is actually a crucial scene, not just for the episode, but for Paris as a character. Obviously, it's at this stage, it's fairly well known that this episode, the fact that Paris was put in the pilot seat was conceived because all up to this point, Paris had been introduced as a very important character and then just hadn't been used really throughout the first season. So it's episodes like this that really build on his character. So I love this scene in his quarters where he successfully pleads with Janeway to let him make the flight. There's that brilliant shot, absolute beautiful up to the shuttle leaving Voyager, turning around, going to warp as Voyager's nacelles are raising and joins it at warp. I just think that's a gorgeous shot. Voyager tries to keep up and then, he breaks the warp 10 barrier and he disappears. And everyone's surprised by this. Infinite velocity, and they're surprised that they lose track of the shuttle. I'm sorry, I thought that was so funny. Like, where is he? We don't know, he's gone. Well, of course you don't. He's gone to transwarp. The shuttle, thankfully, then arrives back fairly quickly, and Paris is out for the count. They bring him aboard, and he's there in sickbay. What's wrong? Is he in a coma? Is he, has he had a hemorrhage? Oh my God, is he dead? And the doctor says, no, he's just asleep. Jamie goes, can you wake him? And he goes, wake up! That's an up. You gotta love how catty the Doctor was at some points. Sorry, catty's my word of the week. There's then a rather sweet scene where, yes, it might be a wee bit melodramatic and over the top, but you have Paris describing what it was like to break the barrier. He says that basically he was everywhere at once. He was in the ship, he was with the Kazon, he was with the Klingons. This is it. We've made magic. I was going to say try not to think of mechanics of it. Don't approach this episode with anything like... What's the best way to put it? I could say nitpicking or thread pulling, but I mean, this is not so much a thread pull as there's an entire carpet hanging in front of you, and if you do that, the whole thing falls apart. So yeah, so the actual science of this might just put that to the side. But that's actually something as well I can't wait to discuss when we get to the observations. Of course, what do you do when you have a successful test flight? You plan for the next one. So, Paris and B'Elanna are sitting in the mess hall, and we get another crapping on Neelix scene. Neelix has made Paris delight, and Paris is like, oh yes, it's very inspiring, thank you. And Neelix is like, why do I even bother? But to be fair, the coffee initially seems to poison him. Whoops. And actually, in fairness, I've had mild allergic reactions to things before, and yeah, you can really, that initial scene of the discomfort and then the headache and everything, Robbie basically nails it. I have never actually collapsed to the floor and had my veins pop out of my face, so when it gets to that bit, I can't say how well a job he's doing, but yeah, up to that point, it really did look like an allergic reaction. But what this leads to is they have to quickly get him to sickbay. We get our first little tease of something's very wrong when the transporter room can't initiate a site-to-site transport to get him to sickbay because they can't lock on. So they have to bring him there manually, and the doctor's trying to figure out what's happening. He can tell it's an allergic reaction, but it's to the water in the coffee. Now, if he's allergic to water, he's in trouble. But there's one understated bit of all of this which is B'Elanna. Her concern as she's watching Paris suffer is, I don't know how early into the journey of Voyager they decided to pair Torres and Paris together, but based on Roxanne Dawson's acting in this scene, it looks like she already has feelings for him, because she looks genuinely upset to see him suffering. Like, that was a great scene. Another person who really stands out in this episode is Robert Picardo as the Doctor, taken up. He's excellent. He is really, really excellent in this episode because, again, remember, this is early Voyager, so the Doctor of, seasons 4 onwards, where he's a bit more loosey-goosey, if you like, he's much more rigid here, and sometimes, look, it's difficult to root for the character. Not so in this episode, because he takes full authority as Chief Medical Officer. He's barking orders, but again, you can see, thanks to Picardo's portrayal, the genuine concern and the genuine worry he has for his patient, thus leading to another fantastic scene. Pause for a second. I have been a bit of an apologist for this episode for a long time, and perhaps the first 3/4 of the episode really stand as the reason why, because there's actually some bloody good scenes. For example, Tom Paris on his deathbed. There's memes of shouting out for pepperoni pizza, but it's the savage openness in which he acts. He talks to the Doctor about his room where he spent years locking himself away, crying, and then turns on a dime and says, I lost my virginity in that room. And considering the context he's just set up, that's quite a sad story, or quite a happy story, whichever way you decide to look at it, in that this room that is a place of sadness and isolation is where, he would either change the meaning of that, or he now associates that with sadness and isolation, which may explain a lot of his sort of Lothario-esque actions in seasons 1, 2, and, into 3 as well. It's a bloody good scene, and again, Robert Duncan McNeill is just fabulous in this episode. I mean, Tom Paris dies in this episode. Kes gets a scene, which is nice for season 2. It's just a shame Kes is such a wasted character in Voyager. But there is a lovely moment where, as he's dying, he says, can I have one last kiss? Unfortunately, he's in a section of the sickbay that's been sealed off because he can no longer, breathe oxygen. So which means Kes can't come to him. And when he's dead, they free up the section. And she does give him a goodbye kiss. And the day goes on, and the Doctor is doing his notes, and he hears a kind of a scratching. And he goes over to Paris's body and removes the tarp, and wouldn't you know it, Paris is back. Wait, what? Guess we'll always have Paris. We proceed to effectively the body horror part of the episode. Now, this is an up, right? This is a big up, because as a fan of Cronenberg films, I'm pretty okay with body horror and seeing it. And bear in mind, Star Trek has often pushed the boat, but it was also a primetime television show at the time. So there's only really so far you can go. Okay, tell that to TNG's Conspiracy. This pushes it right to the point. The makeup on Robert Duncan McNeill for his de-evolution, or evolution, we'll discuss that. It's gross, it's uncomfortable, and it's brilliant. Now, aided by Robbie's portrayal, I see exactly why this is Emmy Award winning. I mean, say what you like about Threshold, say what you like about the script, this is an Emmy Award winning episode. It physically broke my heart to know that it was up against The Visitor from Deep Space Nine for an Emmy, and it beat The Visitor. But now, in terms of makeup, with the greatest of respect to the makeup artist looking after Tony Todd playing old Jake Sisko, I mean, they ran Tom Paris through a cheese grater and brought him out the other side, and it still works. Which is why, this sounds so silly. My latinum up of the episode is how yuck they managed to make Tom Paris look. and how Robert Duncan McNeill still manages to make us care for the character. Because I'm not sure yet how we're going to go our retro ups and downs in terms of Voyager episodes and early Voyager episodes, if we can, I'd like to start a series that I like to call Michael Jonas. He's a down just for existing. It's nothing against Raphael Sbarge. Nothing against him. I loathe Michael Jonas, and I'm going to go and rewatch Investigations after this. But yes, he's there trying to sell, if you like, the information about Warp 10 to the Kazon, because he's trying to get in with Seska, he's betraying the crew. It's a whole ongoing thing. But I just hate him, and he is a down for being alive in this episode. The last great scene, if you like, of this episode is the exchange between Paris and Janeway. The scene where he pulls out his tongue. I mean, it's... But it's an up. That whole exchange, again, you've got Robert Duncan McNeill is being tasked with move between lucidity, as the Doctor puts it, lucidity and deranged behavior, and he nails it because he manages to balance the rage that's going on from his body is tearing itself apart and putting itself back together every second. And remember, it's stated by the Doctor, this is all happening over a 24-hour period. And the fact that he's not more deranged is a bit of a shock, but the back and forth between him and Janeway in this scene, it's painful to watch. Directing all of this anger towards her, and she is having to take it effectively. It's just, it's masterfully handled. And then I suppose she gets a break when he pulls out his tongue and can't speak for a while, which leads then to a little bit later, you know, he tries to impress upon Kes and the Doctor that he has to get out. He can't stay here, he has to leave. At this point you can see things are starting to break down within Tom and his perception of reality, because he says the past is in the future is in the past, you have to understand. And in fairness to the Doctor and Kes, they're like, we understand. The Doctor then stumbles on the cure. Folks, I'm not going to lie to you. So pretty much from the moment the Doctor says, we have a cure, right up to the end, down. I mean, this act is why this episode is as loathed as it is. Paris in full pre-salamander state, he's, you know, in the isolation tube beside the warp core. All right, the Doctor says, yeah, basically we're just going to pump him full of radiation. There's a good moment where he's like, you know, kind of, oh, my epitaph is going to be, you know, radioactive mutant. I know that came earlier in the episode, but I like that. And then, you know, he breaks out, and then there's that incredibly uncomfortable scene of the turbo lift where he kidnaps Janeway, and then they steal the shuttle, or he steals the shuttle, sorry, and they take it to warp, and 3 days later, Tuvok and Chakotay shoot them as salamanders and abandon their children on the planet. They're like, there's a reason, Pete. It's just, but the whole thing falls apart. That's why Threshold is, in my opinion, as poorly regarded as it is. It's like, what's even happening here? Because then, like, 5 seconds later, you've got Janeway and Paris sitting on biobeds, back to fully human. And the Doctor says something about, oh, we need to leave you waiting here for 3 days to make sure everything's fine. But they're fine. They've done it. They've cured it. Okay, great. Bring the ship to Warp 10 and pump everyone full of that radiation as soon as you get to the other side. It's been addressed time and time again. But listen, you watch it enough times, I guess you stop caring as much. There is a nice sweet scene at the end where Paris, you know, there's that interplay, which I choose to believe was put in where Janeway says to Paris, how do you know you were the instigator? A lot of the time, females are the initiator. You know, I thought about having children, but not with you. I choose to believe that this line was deliberately inserted so that they could remove any sort of suggestions that, so did Paris? You can hide behind the same thing I hide behind, is that caused by crazy spatial anomaly nonsense. Moving on. And then you have that sweet scene where Paris says, I've got to stop basing my own self-worth on what others think of me. I've got to just pay attention to what I think of me. And it's as nice an ending as I think the episode could have at this point. There's entire sections of story that were left on the cutting room floor, such as the exploration that the evolution of humanity might not look like Telosians, if you like, from the cage, big brains and able to control everything. Maybe the higher form of life might look like where we came from, which is the swamps. And initially, there was this idea to include that in the story, but for whatever reason it was cut out. And according to Brannon Braga, who wrote the teleplay for the episode, who has, God love him, he's taken a kicking for this episode ever since it was released. But he said the entire point of the episode was lost with the removal of that, which means the episode is just meaningless. Some stuff happens and then it's undone, the end. And we never talk about it again. And yeah, it's dreadful. Like, why? You have cured the problem. But yes, I think it's time to have a look at temporal observations. I mean, I couldn't be, I wanted to share my Tom Parisisms here. Temporal observations. So, once again, just a quick explanation that this differs a little bit from cetacean observations in that, while yes, we'll be going through Easter eggs within the episode, we'll also talk a little bit about how this episode has moved on into infamy. We get our discussion of transwarp. I mean, we've been talking about that since back in Star Trek 3 with the Excelsior. This is the first appearance of the Type 9 shuttle that would be kind of famous throughout Voyager. We get that lovely shot of the holodeck as well. Now, this holodeck is almost uniquely Voyager, except for that time it rocked up in Deep Space Nine. The nacelles are said to be comprised of a duranium alloy. Now, duranium is something that gets used again and again and again in Star Trek, but I always think of that scene for The Way of the Warrior. It is an illusion created by thoron fields and duranium shadows. Sorry, I love that. I love that. Warp 10. Now, we've already addressed the Warp 10 in the room. Paris talks about you could be everywhere within the wink of an eye. Nice little name shout out there to the original series episode. You gotta love that, like, even in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, they were like, well, in the last couple of centuries, we've learned how to use technology safely. Yeah, well, what's that meme? That one didn't age quite so well. Transwarp. Let's just address it, right? Okay, hang on. Transwarp, introduced quite early on in Star Trek as, basically the next best thing in propulsion. There's the big, discussion of, did the Excelsior's transwarp trials fail or succeed? Did they help redesign the warp scale? Which would, now this is very much obviously fan headcanon, but that would lead quite nicely into the next generation's redefining of Warp 10 being the absolute barrier. However, as we go on from this, where do Borg transwarp corridors come into this? Where does Slipstream come into this? Where does the proto-drive come into this? They are all said to be faster than the top speed of all Starfleet ships. And we're talking warp 9.975. How many decimals does this thing go on for before you just have to accept, maybe we should just change this scale? Warp 10 seems too close of a limit. So it invites too many questions, darn it. Now, to explain one of my downs, when Janeway was listing out the famous pilots, she lists out Orville Wright, Neil Armstrong, Zefram Cochrane. Of course, Cochrane, the man who invented, for humanity anyway, warp drive. Neil Armstrong, first person on the moon. And then you have Orville Wright, who is credited as the inventor of the airplane. Now, it's a down because Alberto Santos Dumont would like a word. He was a Brazilian aeronaut who they invented the airplane. He just kind of got pushed out of history. Another very notably missing name, especially because of the comparisons between him and Paris in this episode, is Chuck Yeager. So Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the X-1, which is, you can tell that this was the template for Tom Paris breaking the Warp 10 barrier. So actually it's a bit funny that he wasn't named. So yeah, from a historian's point of view, that's my down. We get references, of course, to Paris's dad, who we know will be Admiral Paris, who we will see as the show goes on. The shuttlecraft itself is named Cochrane, after, of course, Zephyr Cochrane himself. There is a moment that I feel was borrowed recently for Lower Decks, which is Paris going, for a moment I was everywhere, and I just couldn't not see a giant Badgie coming up out of the middle of the Milky Way galaxy. We get some lovely shots of Voyager's biobed. I always love that bit where the things come up and they go... Yep, that is my incredibly accurate way of describing that. Two things. So, but Paris is deranged at this point, which is why they're not reaching my down list. But if you ever notice Taurus doesn't cry, what's with that? She's half Klingon, mate. I mean, I would just assume she has no tear ducts. And then my father always says crying is a sign of weakness, which may have been accurate at the writing of this episode, but certainly that's not the Admiral Paris that we saw as the show went on. A main character dies. The Doctor can't do anything about it, and it's quite sudden, and it's very reminiscent of Tasha Yar's death, except the fact that this one meant something and we cared. Paris has two hearts. He's a Time Lord. Convince me I'm wrong. We love, of course, the fact that Majel Barrett makes a vocal cameo. Lizard babies. You need to, hopefully you have, but you need to watch at least two things after watching this episode. First, I want you to go and watch the Gazelle Automation's animated series version of this episode. When I say it is so good, you'll love it. You will absolutely love it. You'll find it on YouTube. The other one you must watch is, you need to watch 2 Vix, the opening episode of Star Trek Lower Decks' 4th season. I mean, the lizard babies, maybe not the OG ones, but they certainly get some form of revenge for being left behind on the planet. Chakotay's the worst uncle in the world. The episode came from an idea that was originally pitched by Michael DeLuca, who was at the time the head of New Line Cinema. Thanks very much for the Lord of the Rings, by the way. On the pepperoni pizza that Tom Paris is shouting for, he said it would go nice with some Kavarian olives. That is a very blink and you'll miss it reference to the DS9 episode For the Cause, where Jake Sisko says he is studying Kavarian tiger bats. Random. But no, one of the funniest legacies to come out of this episode is the fact that in 2018, a user named BioTrekkie, who as of now he's asked to remain anonymous to the source that we checked for this, wrote about this episode a scientific breakdown, a paper, and submitted it to predatory online scientific journals. Now what that means is that they were using this episode's science as proof that there are scientific journals out there that will just do anything to make a quick buck. And using Threshold and the evolution and de-evolution of Tom Paris, they wrote a faux scientific paper, submitted it, and it was accepted by several different papers and published by one of them, just to point out the absolute nonsense that was going on out there. And I think that is fabulous. That is everything for our list today, folks. Thank you so much for watching along, and I hope you found this interesting. We will be back with a poll soon. So, as you probably know, I am recording this a couple of weeks in advance because I have taken a holiday. But I will be back, as you're watching this, I'll be back very soon, and we will run a poll for the next selection of episodes. So remember, you need to vote to make sure that we can pick the one that you like the best. So, follow us over on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Blue Sky, follow us on TikTok. I'm at Sean Ferrick on the various socials. You're all awesome and you're wonderful. Jeti dovo I prostvitati. Your continued support makes this possible. So thank you very much. To our friends in the Middle East, hopefully a ceasefire is on the horizon. Peace and sanity needs to return. And that's what we are all hoping for. To everyone out there, look after yourselves. Until I talk to you again, make it so.